All right. Thank you all so much for joining this webinar. We very much appreciate you all taking the time to come and talk about a policy that is near and dear to many of our hearts, which is early childhood education and care, ECEC. We've developed, and as usual, when I say we, I do not mean me. I mean Harris Eppsteiner and John Ricco and Maddie Lee on our team. Um, that is, attempting to look at these a range of early childhood policies, but really kind of trying to look at, the equilibrium effects and how this can sort out, and looking at impacts across a range of outcomes. So, patterns of childcare usage, parental employment, cost burdens, the prices that childcare providers charge, wages earned by care workers, what this means for the federal budget, children's future economic outcomes. And obviously, different policies can affect each of these differently, and it's really important to kind of take a holistic picture with the whole thing. So, again, we are so grateful that all of you have taken the time on what is, at least in DC, an objectively beautiful Monday afternoon to come and listen to a bunch of researchers talk. And with that, I will hand it over to Harris.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, like Martha said, for joining us so much. My name is Harris Eppsteiner, and I'm an Associate Director of Economic Analysis here at the Budget Lab at Yale. And along with John Ricco, who you'll be hearing from later on our panel, and our wonderful colleague, Maddie Lee, and one of the co-authors of some new research that we put out a few weeks ago, uh, as Martha said, thinking about a topic that is very near and dear to our hearts, and increasingly one that is of more general interest to the American public, early childhood education and care. So, as you all know, this is a topic that is this is an area that is a major driver of costs for parents of young children, and with increasing interest in affordability, we at the Budget Lab decided to take a look at this topic area and ask, in our first report on the subject, what would be the impacts of possible federal subsidy policies for ECEC. I should note at the outset that this is the first in a series of plan reports that we at the Budget Lab are going to be putting out, focusing on policies intended to help families with young children. So that's going to include paid family and medical leave and pre-K expansion. So as they say, watch this space. So to answer the question of how these policies would affect families, providers, and the federal budget, we at the Budget Lab built a new open source structural equilibrium microsimulation model. I want to stress the equilibrium part of that because that means that the model includes both the demand side for care, parents making decisions about whether and how much to work, as well as what to do in terms of care arrangements for their young children, but also critically the supply side, providers of care hiring care workers to meet that parental demand. We use the model to, as Martha said, look at a very wide range of outcomes, not just in the short run, but over a full 30-year time horizon. The outcomes we look at include, obviously, patterns of enrollment in different forms of childcare, parental employment choices, because as we all know, those are inherently tied up with decisions about care for parents of young children, cost burdens, out-of-pocket spending for families across the income distribution. On the supply side, the size of the care workforce and the wages that these care providers earn, which itself has been a topic of policy interest for folks who are thinking about this area. Children's future economic outcomes, and in particular, how care decisions made today affect the earnings that they'll earn in adulthood. And finally, because we are the Budget Lab at Yale, the effects of these different policies on the federal budget. In terms of the policies that we choose to highlight in our first report, we picked 5 illustrative policies that do 2 things. One is that they illustrate the range of policies that our model is able to accommodate. So both, as you'll see, both large-scale subsidy policies, but also smaller changes to the tax treatment of childcare expenditures. But then also we wanted to start the process of analyzing policies that are broadly similar to a number of existing legislative proposals. The five policies that we look at in this initial report are a policy where we offer free childcare for low-income families, and we cap out-of-pocket childcare expenses for families further up the income distribution. In the charts that are going to follow this slide, you'll see that labeled as the universal subsidy. A policy that's identical to the one that I just described, except that families making more than 250% of national median income are made ineligible. We call that the income limited subsidy policy. A smaller change in which we expand the child and dependent care tax credit and enhance it to cover more expenses and help lower income families benefit more fully from that tax credit. We call that the expanded care credit policy. On the supply side, we think about a supply policy that subsidizes a portion of labor costs for providers of early care and education via tax credit. That's called the provider tax credit. And finally, a $1,000 per child allowance that families will have access to regardless of care choices or their income. I want to stress that this report is huge. I believe it's actually the Budget Lab's longest report to date. So there's a lot in there that I'm not going to be able to cover in the next few minutes. But I do want to highlight a few of the top line results that we found when analyzing these five illustrative policies. But I highly recommend looking at the full report. I believe we'll be sending out a link, or it's available on our website on the landing page. So just a few top lines from our analysis of these five policies. In terms of effects on childcare enrollment, each of these policies, because they're designed in different ways and target different folks at different points in the income distribution who use different forms of childcare more or less, create distinct incentives for families to place their children in different types of ECEC. The most generous subsidy policies that we analyzed, the universal and income limited subsidies, would generate the largest shifts into formal care arrangements. In particular, they would see about a 14 percentage point inflow into formal care, that's center and home-based care, off a baseline of just under 30%. So it's about a 50% increase in utilization of those formal childcare arrangements. On the other end of the spectrum, the child allowance policy, which, as I said, doesn't focus on any particular form of childcare, would leave enrollment patterns largely unchanged. The remaining policies are somewhere in between. In terms of maternal employment, as I said before, these are choices that, for anyone who's the parent of a young child knows, the choice of whether and how much to work is inherently tied into what your child is going to be doing during that time. So we include that obviously in the outcomes that we look at. The most generous subsidies we analyze would increase maternal employment by about 6 percentage points off a base of just over 70%. The remaining policies range all the way down from the child allowance, which barely moves it, and then the other policies, again, are somewhere in between the generous subsidy policies and the child allowance. Because we use an equilibrium model, we think about the interaction of demand and supply. So thinking about just those large-scale subsidy policies, in order to meet the additional demand for formal care, care providers are going to have to scale up massively. And in particular, the care workforce is going to need to expand by a little more than 500,000 additional full-time workers. To do that, care workers are going to need to raise wages to attract workers from other sectors to come into the care sector. And we estimate that those subsidy policies would lead to increases in care worker wages of about 15 to 30%, depending on care workers' level of education. One of the more exciting parts of our model, I think, is trying to think not just about the short-term effects of these policies, but also what are the long-run effects on children. To take a first stab at this, we use existing research that documents the benefits of different forms of childcare arrangements on children's medium-run outcomes in school. We then link those estimates to other estimates that connect those outcomes at school to later in life outcomes in terms of earnings to get estimates of what the different effects of different policies would be on children's earnings later in life. The basic idea is that different policies incentivize children to be placed in different forms of care. That switching has these impacts later on in life. We find that the two large-scale subsidy policies would, because they are the most generous, would generate the most switching. Like I said, about a 50% increase in utilization of formal care. Those would generate the largest estimated gains at age 27, and those effects are concentrated among lower and middle income families who benefit the most from these policies. In terms of the budgetary effects, as I said, our goal here was to estimate a range of policies. So the effects in the federal budget vary pretty meaningfully depending on the level of generosity of the policy under consideration. I put the 10, 20, and 30-year totals here up on this slide for folks to peruse. This is also table 3 in our report. One thing I do just want to highlight, because I know this has been a topic of discussion, is that we find that excluding high-income families, those making more than 250% of national median income, doesn't actually lead to substantially lower costs from the standpoint of the federal government. And that's mostly because parents of young children generally, among parents of young children, there are actually very few who are above that 250% of median income threshold. Finally, we are able to do a calculation that asks to what extent these policies pay for themselves in a very narrow sense. And I want to be clear about what we're showing here. So we take our child earnings estimates and we ask, of that additional income in the future, some amount is going to be recaptured in the form of federal income taxes, federal individual income and payroll taxes. And we ask what share of the initial upfront expenditure on the policy is brought back into the federal government via this channel. Two quick caveats. This doesn't include outcomes like decreased public assistance, decreased criminal justice involvement, or other potential channels for federal savings that have been identified in the literature. Additionally, it doesn't capture fiscal benefits to states and localities from these federal policies increasing children's future earnings. But even in that but if you just think of that narrow sense of how much these policies pay for themselves, none of them fully pay for themselves. The one that does so the most, the one that has the highest, what we call in the paper, the highest federal fiscal recovery ratio, we find is the expanded care credit, which recovers about a little under, is the provider tax credit, I should have said, that recovers a little under 1/4 of the upfront expenditure in a net present value sense. So like I said, there's an enormous amount in the report that I wasn't able to get to just now. Highly recommend taking a look. We have both a non-technical executive summary as well as the full report available on our website, and I believe we're also putting the links in the chat. With that, I'm going to turn things over to our panel, and I'll hand things off to Moriah Balingit from the Associated Press.
Moriah, you're muted.
Now I'm not muted. Okay, I wanted to quickly introduce our panel. First, we have Elena Patel, co-director of the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center, and the Posen Director's Chair and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Diane Whitmore Schanzenbach, McCourt Chair in the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown, and John Ricco, Associate Director of Policy Analysis at the Budget Lab. And actually, I wanted to start pretty big picture. I started covering childcare at the end of 2023 and had a conversation with Martha in which she talked about how the way we typically talk about policies does not always capture the benefits of early education policy and early care policy. And, typically, if we look 10 years out, we don't always capture what some of the upsides and where we actually see our investments pay off. I wanted to ask you all, what is missing from the current discourse around childcare policy? When you see it play out on the federal and state level among pundits, what are people not talking about and what's missing?
I'll go ahead and give it a start. So I do think that something that I love about this work from the Yale Budget Lab is pushing the conversation in the direction of thinking about the importance of this topic to the economy, not just to families' affordability, although it is crucial there, but also, also as a work support and also as in that child development. To be sure, we're getting more and more evidence that decisions that we make today about investments in children pay off over decades and decades to come. And, would I bet my, salary on, that we've got this number nailed in the long term? Probably not, but we certainly know what direction it goes. And I really appreciate the Yale Budget Lab's attention to that as part of the important benefits of a stronger childcare system.
Yeah, I would just jump in, especially from the perspective of tax policy and fiscal policy. I think that it's a complex undertaking that Yale Budget Lab has embarked on, trying to think about not only 10, but 20 and 30-year fiscal estimates. And I think we're in an environment where every dollar of federal spending, I think rightly gets even more scrutiny than it might have 20 years ago. And so these estimates are a really important part of the fiscal debate about how to spend all of our federal dollars, including how we use the tax code and the federal system to support young children.
Yeah, and then finally, I just add on to those two comments that, one thing I do really like about the framework that we've set up here is that we look at so many different metrics. I think one sort of founding principle of the Budget Lab is that in Washington, D.C., especially during the budgeting process, it can be very easy just to look at these big abstract numbers where we say, okay, this childcare expansion costs $500 billion. And like maybe a couple of people who work at these, these kind of nerdy think tanks like us know what that means. But that's really hard for people to actually think about concretely. And so that's why we're trying to present estimates on things like maternal employment, on enrollment, on care worker wages. Like, for example, we know I have a good sense of what going from, for example, $25 an hour for a BA worker in the childcare sector to $32 an hour. It's like that's something I can think about. And so for us, we see our value add here as trying to present all of the different metrics, and then people with their own views on like where policy should go can evaluate those trade-offs.
And John, what led you to pursue this particular analysis? Like, why now?
Yeah, I mean, now is a kind of interesting point you might bring up because I think it would be no surprise to say that there's been less interest in this at the federal policymaking level in the last couple of years, especially when compared to the previous 4 years under the Biden administration, where there was very large legislation in the Build Back Better Act proposing similar policies to what we score in here. I think it's mostly a matter of, again, building out some of the modeling capacity at the Budget Lab for what we see are the gaps in the analytical toolkit for people thinking about policy. Even if nothing's going to pass this year per se, or this is not going to be a live issue of debate, to sort of build this up so that, well, if and when this does become a major national policy topic again, we'll be ready to provide sort of fact-based analysis.
Can I add to that? Just wanted to underscore that this is such an important affordability question. Parents are speaking loud and clear. So even if, maybe this particular Congress isn't going to start introducing legislation right now, I think we're seeing that real serious responses to the affordability crisis in childcare are going to need to come up. And so hopefully, we'll get to a point where some of this groundwork that's being done is taken up on the Hill.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask both John and the other panelists, when you looked at the analysis, what was striking to you? What was surprising to you?
Yeah, I mean, I'll quickly describe, having spent much of the last year looking at these numbers every day. I think from my perspective, I didn't fully appreciate just how linked the household side, like the parent decision-making side and their spending on childcare and how linked it is to the outcomes of the workers in this sector. That's kind of, in some sense, it's a little obvious when you say, of course, like this money is flowing through to pay the wages of the workers in this sector. But when you look at the numbers, I mean, it really, and everyone sort of has an intuition for this, but it really is striking the degree to which this is a very labor intensive sector. And that's something that is not really amenable to automation or sort of labor saving technology. Like good childcare in some sense is defined by, certain staff ratios and having the workers be trusted adults around your children. And so, in our framework, the sort of interaction between these two, where if more demand from subsidies is flowing into the sector, that's going to require hiring a bunch of new workers in order to get those workers from other sectors. You need to raise wages. There's some sort of feedback there that I think accomplishes multiple goals at once for some policymakers. The flip side, of course, being that the more you sort of try to meet those two goals, you're going to see some costs on the fiscal side, and that's sort of the trade-off that I think people need to look at.
Yeah, we don't have childcare robots yet, or let's hope we never have childcare robots. Elena and Diane,
Yeah.
what?
I would love to jump in and highlight something that I think like fits into a narrative that I like to make sure people see all the time. I think what's really one of the really cool figures in this, and you could see it in the executive summary, is what happens to maternal employment rates. And I think there's two things to note there. And the most striking thing might be to people, or I'd like to point it out to people, is sometimes these policies, like paid leave policies, get touted as like the silver bullet to the gender wage gap. And like, oh, if only we had early childhood care, then suddenly moms would be working at much higher rates. And I do think there's certainly, a population of mothers for whom the childcare decision is the margin by which they're working or not. But for the vast majority of women, that's not true. And so what you see here is even for the most generous policy, you get a bump in maternal employment of just 6 percentage points. And so I say that to try to focus the work on where I think it is most impactful, which is early childhood outcomes, rather than as a silver bullet to what some people see as a puzzle of women's low labor force participation. And I think those things are related to things that are much bigger than the tax system and early childcare. And it's good to see that coming out of these figures.
I have to say that was also striking to me that if you offer, this limited version of universal subsidy, that the maternal workforce rate only goes up by 6%. I think a lot of advocates would have you believe that it would go up to 100%, or that it would go up pretty significantly, that there's a lot of women making decisions about whether to work or not simply based on the cost of childcare. What does it say to us that number is maybe a little smaller than we might have expected?
I mean, to me, it just says that like a mother's decision to work is much more complicated and constrained in different ways across different households than singularly rests on something like early child care access or paid family leave, or it's another example of policies that advocates like to tout as the silver bullet to the gender wage gap. And there's been a lot of great work coming out that I think brings nuance to that picture. And I just like to make sure I say it whenever I can, because I wouldn't want people to pass a policy like this and then be disappointed that suddenly mothers aren't working at the same rate as fathers, when I just don't think these policies were ever designed to do that. I think they're designed to leverage the system to increase well-being for mothers, which is a lot of good evidence in a lot of these cases that well-being is improved, and increase and improve outcomes for children. And the labor market decision, I think, is just a different part of that.
I'd add to that I asked the Friends of the Budget Lab who wrote this for some more distributional tables, which is on brand for me. And one of the things I learned from that was how concentrated these effects are in the bottom 3 quintiles. So I personally thought we would see more of the maternal employment increase coming at the very bottom. I was not surprised to see it not really come through the top 2. But what I learned from them is that quintiles 2 and 3 are actually quite responsive. I'm seeing something like a 10 percentage point increase in the likelihood of being employed.
So this is like the middle group, the 25 to 75%.
Exactly, where our current system kind of isn't as generous. And, they're really facing that affordability crunch. And, one of the things that I really like about this is, let's think about, what would it look like to reduce the affordability problem for families sort of more in that second and third quintile. And then related to that, really that what I was surprised the most by in my reading of this was that the universal and the more targeted subsidies just weren't all that different. And I did not expect that
Yeah, I mean
in
that's
terms of
certainly
costs. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, that's certainly something I've seen on the ground with my reporting. Many states offer subsidies for very poor families, but you have to be quite poor to qualify. And certainly people that fall right above that or even far above that still can't afford childcare or
Hmm.
it's a major burden for them. Um, but yeah, I think what's interesting about this too is this is a projection, obviously, but it also tells us a lot about where we are now. I'm curious to know what this reveals about, yeah, where we are now in with the childcare industry, with their policies and things along those lines.
I mean, I think
Um,
I would just start by
so,
saying like there are some real supply side things going on that, supply side is very hard to solve through the tax code. So I think we found that in housing and in a lot of other lanes where we like to use the tax code to do a lot of policy because it's administratively easy to access, but it's difficult to nudge the supply side through the tax code. And so I think I love that there's a supply side policy in here. And it's some of the thing I think about, which is sort of like what is the source of market failure? And some of it is certainly a hiring problem. Early childhood education centers complain about this a lot. They did during the pandemic, and there were some policies there to try to help that. But it's also, maybe even bigger than that. But that's where you start to stretch the use of the tax code to be able to use that system to solve the market failure, which we face a shortage. That's part of the affordability problem. And so, how do you alleviate the shortage in the long run is one of the questions out there.
Yeah, what could be a tax policy that would alleviate the supply problem?
Well, we've got other policy. Wait, are we only allowed to think about tax
Oh,
policies?
no, no, no. I
No,
was just curious
exactly.
because
So, uh, I would say, sort of to your sort of meta question at the beginning here, is I would love to see more on the firm side. We know that this is not a well-functioning market, and in recent months, we saw real big threats to the whole industry, such as the threatened zeroing out of Head Start. Something that I've learned about the childcare market, especially in Chicago, where I do a lot of my research, is how much funding streams are blended and braided. And if you threaten to sort of yank out one of those by the roots, basically what our analysis in Chicago suggested was a big portion of the childcare sector would crumble as a result. We found that one out of every four childcare seats in the city of Chicago are touched by Head Start funding, and that's either because there are a lot of Head Start kids in the childcare center, and if those suddenly went away, the firms would be in real trouble. The childcare centers would be in real trouble. So I would love to see someone. It doesn't need to be the Yale Budget Lab, but some serious analysis of interaction with other policies. What would happen if in the background, we did, an expansion of CCDBG, or, what if we did, X, Y, or Z to Head Start, expanding early Head Start, something like that. Just like, help us think about sort of this complex infrastructure that's already built up, and then how, different options, layer on to that.
and just for the folks who are not childcare policy nerds here, CCBDG is not the name of a nightclub. It is the Child Care Development Block Grant, and it is the main source of subsidies for low-income families in the states, and it's run through states. And I'm actually working on a big story about it and whether it's adequate and things along those lines. Um, but I think we did have a question too. It was a good one. So I'm just scrolling through the chat. Have you looked at the effects on future birth rates, the likelihood that women would have more children as a result of these policies? Is that something you would anticipate at all?
Yeah, we didn't look at this in this report specifically. I think in part because I don't think there's great evidence on this one way or another, which is, not necessarily the best reason to like not include something or not. But the we have much better evidence for outcomes that are more contemporaneous. So, things like we can observe just in like the micro data, for example, that we have on this topic, the patterns of how maternal employment varies with the access to different kinds of care choices. We can look at very careful causal studies looking at how people change their behavior in response to these things. But something like fertility is like frank. I mean, it's one of the like biggest puzzles in some sense of our time, and wading into that in this kind of narrower budget sense was not something we were necessarily looking for.
And I would add to that, I think that the evidence from Europe isn't all that promising that sort of small changes in childcare affordability will, reverse, declining birth rates. But that said, we get more of items that we subsidize and we get less of things that we tax. And so, if we make a concerted effort toward, supporting families, making sure that lifestyle is affordable, economic theory would certainly predict, an increase in birth rates. How big that is a question of measurement that I just don't think we can do yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly something that we hear a lot, that if it were more affordable, if childcare were more affordable, if maybe we had an expanded childcare or child tax credit, if it were easier to raise a child and less financially burdensome. I think that's one of the number one lesson I've learned from covering this beat is that having a child makes you poor. I mean, it makes you much more financially vulnerable. That's where we see the highest rates of poverty, the highest rates of hunger, the highest rates of homelessness. So, there's this idea that if we just ease all of that, that people would start having more babies. What kind of dramatic policy would that actually take? And what are sort of the shortcomings of that argument, I guess?
I mean, I would just start by echoing what Diane has already said, which is the good news from the standpoint of the United States is we're at the bottom of the ladder, which means we can look to other countries to kind of see sort of what the scope is in terms of safety net and family and maternal support and how that translates into these questions. And the truth is that fertility rates are declining everywhere. So if you thought like, if only we had a bigger safety net, then we would do better in the US. I'm sure there is some link between those two. But again, if you're searching for the exact policy that's the silver bullet to declining fertility, which is a real demographic problem. I think that it's not this particular policy in isolation. I think we've learned that again in the context of Europe and across a wide variety of safety net and support systems where everybody's facing the same long-run declines.
And building on these points, having children who are experiencing brain development and learning the skills that they need for the next economy, having them experience the most poverty, the most hunger, just makes very little sense. And there's just a lot that we're not doing well in this whole sector, as in the United States in terms of subsidizing and funding kids.
And yeah, I'm curious to know what else you found striking about this report. Any other John, was there anything particularly that you were particularly excited to see when you did this analysis?
Yeah, I think one thing that Harris didn't have enough time to cover in his 10 minutes of upfront presentation was our work on the distributional impacts. So, we looked at aggregate fiscal costs, we looked at aggregate effects on maternal labor supply, aggregate enrollment patterns. But at the end of the day, I do think, in Moriah, your reporting would probably point in this direction that the number one consideration that people have in mind here is reducing out-of-pocket expenditures for families, especially at lower levels of income, where it's just not financially viable given the, again, economic reality of producing, so to speak, childcare is just so labor intensive. You're just going to need subsidies to reduce costs for those families. And so in our report, we look at the impacts in terms of how it affects people's our parents' well-being across different points of the income distribution. There's a whole wonky development we sort of added on here in terms of defining well-being in a kind of economist way that accounts for the fact that, people like income, but they also like flexibility and their choices, and you want to take into account all of these different factors. And what we found is that a lot of these larger subsidies do have very progressive benefits across the income distribution, meaning that as a percentage of income, the benefits are larger at the low end of the income distribution than at the high end. That's not true for all policies. I mean, one of the policies where we find a much more flat or even slightly regressive impact is on the provider side subsidy policy. And so what's happening there is that currently, on average, people who are higher income are more likely to participate in care arrangements that are more in the formal sector, so higher price center-based cares, things of that nature. And so when you subsidize the production of care through those kinds of firms by reducing their the effective break-even price that they can charge to essentially stay in business and continue to operate, that's going to flow through to consumers, or I should say parents, in the form of lower sticker prices. But lower sticker prices, again, due to that baseline pattern of arrangement, is going to benefit higher income parents a little more than lower income parents. And that's something I didn't quite expect, or it wasn't obvious to me ex ante that would be the case. And so just another example of how modeling this stuff explicitly and sort of testing out who benefits, who loses, what are the trade-offs, is something valuable for people thinking about those trade-offs.
There's a audience question I'm going to quickly get to, but I wanted to first ask, there is a bit of a debate, and there's always been a tension over whether we should offer these benefits universally versus make them targeted. So we see New York City, New Mexico offering universal childcare or aiming to offer universal childcare. What does this analysis tell us about that debate? How does it inform that debate of whether we should target these benefits just at the poorest households, or whether we should make it available to almost anybody? I think in New Mexico, it's not available to 400% maybe of the state median income, but virtually everybody else. I'm trying to start a fight here. I don't know if you can tell.
So my instinct is almost always to go more targeted. And one of the things that surprised me in this, one was that it was able to move my priors. And I was much more supportive of something more universal based on the cost estimates that they did. I think that, they really have highlighted the big gaps in assistance around the second and third quintile of income. And right, even though I normally am, sort of start by saying, well, let's do targeted, it'll save money, it'll sort of concentrate the dollars where we think that the impact is the greatest. I am much more convinced by their analysis that universal is viable and is a good way to go.
Yeah, I would just,
Elena.
Yeah. I was just going to add a couple of thoughts. One, I think this does move the needle in thinking about the cost benefit trade-off in terms of fiscal dollars. I also think there's always a political economy trade-off because these are spending programs. And so the way they're marketed to voters and marketed to the Hill matters quite a bit. And so I still think, despite there being a small dollar value difference between universal and targeted, given that it's an uphill battle on the Hill anyway to engage in these policies, I still think there probably is value in a more targeted policy. And then, of course, there are other levers that you can pull. When you think about universal versus capped, you can play with the cap rate, and you can do some things to take all of the dollars and even more target them. And childcare is a consumption good. I say that because that means there's always going to be a bottom part of the income distribution that will benefit from subsidy. And so, even if the market were to clear, there would still be a population for whom childcare is unaffordable. And I think there's always a role for these policies as part of the safety net to make sure that all kids are getting into care situations that benefit them later on. And so, wrapping back to the political economy, that's why I think it's valuable to sort of talk about these in a targeted sense to make them as palatable as possible in the policymaking space.
And if I could quickly jump into and add another result that comes out of our model, again, based on the kind of dynamic interactions that we've built in here, you do see this in the distributional analysis, is that if you do target benefits, it's not as if necessarily you're saying, okay, the bottom part of the income distribution that I'm targeting gets a benefit, and that those who are not eligible are just made no worse off. They're just sort of flat. It is often the case that actually those who are not subsidized in this framework actually do end up slightly or meaningfully worse off, given the dynamics in the market, where, again, you have this sort of wraparound circular framework where the subsidized families try to buy more care, they try to enroll into these slots. The supply side has to expand slots. They have to hire more workers, they have to pay higher wages. That's going to push up prices. And if you're subsidized, you may not feel any or all of that increase in the sticker price. But if you're not subsidized, that comes as a cost on your out-of-pocket spending. And so that might be a perfectly viable trade-off to make in terms of who pays for the benefits at the low end. But it is, to Elena's point, perhaps a political economy consideration about, pay fors here.
And this may be a small detail too, and I'm not sure if this is something you factored into your analysis, but many state child care assistance programs that are funded by the federal government do not pay market rate. They pay below market rate. So that means a child care provider who takes on a child who's funded by a voucher is losing money on that child, and that has to be made up by the full tuition parents. So that's another interesting piece. We have a question here. Given that it is easier politically for Congress to expand existing programs, do you have any insight on whether part of the solution for child care affordability is to build up programs like the Child Care Development Fund? And what reforms would need to be made to these programs in order to meet the child care need that the market does not currently meet? Certainly, it seems like that's been the strategy in the past, right? To just build off of the Child Care Development Fund.
And plus one to that, I'd love to see the Yale Budget Lab consider some of those. And, of course, whenever you come out with a report, people ask for more and more and more. But I would really love to see some things that aren't primarily through the tax code, but through this, state partnerships get costed out.
I would also, if we get to ask Yale to do more, which is unfair, but I love this report. One is Diane had some excellent extra distributional tables. And I will say from the policymaker standpoint, you can never publish enough of those because aggregates are always masking heterogeneity. And the rich model that Yale has means that they can spit out infinitely many, which is what makes it hard to figure out what to post. But I would plus one for more, more, more. And I think that we had started a conversation about what else can you do. And something I think to think about in this space in the current environment is what's going on with the immigrant labor force. They're an important part of the workforce that supports childcare. I don't have a sense, and maybe John can speak about how much that is or isn't a part of these modeling estimates, the shrinking size of that labor force. But as a tax person, I'm always a little bit nervous about wage subsidies because to the extent we have them existing in the tax code already, there's not a lot of evidence that they're super effective. There's a lot of evidence that firms capture a lot of that subsidy and it doesn't actually make it to the workers for different reasons that have nothing to do with this policy. And so alternative things to think about in the current environment are just the role that immigrants play in the labor force that supports this industry and sort of what's happening right now as a result of that labor force shrinking.
Yeah, John, do you have any thoughts on whether it's better to build off of what the current structure we have now, or whether it's better to build something brand new?
Yeah, I mean, we don't necessarily view ourselves as saying one thing is better or another from our perspective at the budget lab. I mean, I do think our analysis can speak to people who have views on these things about what kinds of design levers you can pull and what those trade-offs might be. I mean, I think in terms of the like incremental versus blue sky approach that comes up in our report, I mean, we do include the expansion of the care tax credit as one of the major reforms in here, and I kind of view that one as an incremental reform in that, it is an existing program that it's administered. We know how to sort of administer it, at least in its current form. It has been expanded in the recent past. So the policy that we model in the report was based on the 2021 temporary expansion under the American Rescue Plan Act that eventually expired. And so we're modeling that on a sort of permanent forward moving basis. And I think as is often the case, I think one of the trade-offs would be something like when you want to improve or expand the system incrementally, you might find yourself in a situation where the administrability of benefits is maybe not in its most natural place at the scale that you want it. And so, for example, right now, the CDCTC is a relatively small tax credit. It's a sort of thing that the IRS, I think, can handle, create some paperwork, but it's not a huge sort of burden. If it were expanded to be like the size of some of our more generous policies, you really want to do this all through the tax code, that would probably place a lot of stress on the IRS, especially at this moment when they have fewer resources to sort of handle that administrability task. And then also, you also run into issues related to the timing of benefits when you do anything through the tax code. So if, for example, you're giving very large subsidies to families at tax filing season, a lot of families who need financial help are just not going to be able to sort of float tens of thousands of dollars to pay tuition throughout the year and then count on the IRS to pay them back in next spring. That's just not going to be feasible. And so I think roughly you run into some of those trade-offs when you think about expanding existing programs versus starting from scratch and building something new.
Yeah, that has been very interesting to me that all of these most of the radical expansions that have been proposed, not just on the federal level, but on the state level, have just been building off the existing infrastructure. That's exactly what they did in New Mexico. They just expanded their existing CCDF funded program. Because I guess administratively, I guess it just makes a lot more sense. I wanted to ask a question from another attendee. I thought this was a really interesting question. We did a look at maternal workforce labor participation rates. And one of the things I found really interesting is if you're a woman with a college degree and a very young child, you're still more likely to be employed than a woman without a college degree and no young child. So we know that college education makes a huge, huge difference, way larger than having a young child and whether or not you're in the workforce. So this person asked, is there evidence of increased educational attainment for mothers with increased childcare? If women get childcare, can they go back to school?
There is. I think the Head Start Impact Study, which was sort of big randomized control trial from about 15 years ago, I think finds some of that. We never have enough evidence to answer all the questions that we want, but I think there is some of that. I'd also add that um, oftentimes women with college educations can't afford to take a couple of years out of the labor market because they're on this upward trajectory of their earnings profile, and so just taking that time off sort of resets your career in a way that is very costly. Oftentimes, the jobs that employ women with lower levels of education and lower levels of income don't have that same, we call it return to tenure, right? That the experience really matters. And so just the cost, not only in the short run, but also in sort of more the medium run, seems to be a little bit lower. There's some evidence to the contrary of that. I think it's something that we're, trying to work out just in the research literature. But I think the idea that it's less costly for low-income moms to step out of the workforce makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. John or Elena, do you have anything that you wanted to add?
Just like thinking about the question that was like a kernel of it was about how education changes this picture. I just thought it was worth highlighting. Like there are things that you might think of as short run solutions and things that you might think of as long run solutions, all right? And like in the short term, I think politically we're all very concerned about the affordability crisis, which is acute and it's now. And so there are some things like demand side policies that really can deliver benefits, maybe less targeted and less effective, but benefits today. And then there are nudges that might, take years to start to see coming into effect. And so I think of the bucket and spectrum of these things as what can we do to solve things today and what it will possibly affect things in the long run. And so I think it's important to keep those things separate. And, in the long run, I think everybody is trying to grapple with what I see as a severe shortage in the availability of childcare, which, as we keep saying, is not like because of one particular thing. It's going to take a lot of things to help that market kind of come back to equilibrium so that on average people can afford childcare, and then perhaps we're subsidizing low income households to the extent that they just can't afford childcare. But keeping those things separate is important. And then in the literature in general about maternal labor supply, another thing I think worth contemplating to everybody on the call, and I think all of us on this call have thought about this, is for moms in particular, there's also a stickiness in terms of where you are in your birth parity. If you've already had a child, then sometimes these policies coming into effect are not as effective because moms who've already have a kid and then have a second, they've kind of figured out their routine, whatever it is. And so for those moms, policies can be a little bit less effective than for new moms. And so that again gets to this, like what is going to have the most immediate impact versus, over time, when will we start to see the change? And policies that only affect new moms means that in the aggregate, only is a strong word, but mostly affect new moms. It means in the aggregate, trends are going to take longer to kind of show up in aggregate than what we see in the micro data that I think there was a lot of good evidence for.
I'll
Yeah.
just add to that, and when
Yeah,
it
go ahead.
comes to like differences across populations, also moms make different or parents make different decisions with newborns, under age, 1 or 2 than they do 3 or 4. That's sort of a different the demand for childcare. I'm sure that we're just using one average um, elasticity in the model. And that's, of course, reasonable, but I think we would expect to see, different responses, just like we saw, we have some work from the child tax credit where any reduction in employment was really concentrated on um, low earnings moms with the lowest level or with the youngest children.
And what does that signify that those are the women who could not afford childcare?
Yeah. Yeah, and for all sorts of reasons, your preference to stay home with a newborn might be different than your preference to stay home with a 4-year-old.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. I think that's something that's really interesting. I was listening to a Planet Money piece about this, that there's no real comparison when it comes to infant care when we look at Europe versus the US, because Europe has paid leave, and that usually takes care of the infant care, quote unquote, is done by the mother or father. Um, yeah, I'm curious to know, like, what does the research actually tell us? I think these are things that are hotly debated. It's in the capital D discourse. It's all over X. Um, like, what's shaping women's decision about whether to return to work or not, or whether to start working after they have a child?
That's like the question, right, Diane? There's like a very active literature right now that is thinking about, mother's labor supply compared to other women without children, mother's labor supply compared to fathers, since everybody's had a child in that case. And I think that all we're learning from this research is like, yes, it all matters. Access to healthcare matters, right? Access to early childcare, access to paid leave, and also like intrinsic preferences. I think that's where a lot of the literature is going right now, in that we're in actually across the world, again, not the US, much to my chagrin, a very policy rich environment if you look to Europe. And it isn't the case that in Europe that moms are, suddenly going back right back to work after their paid maternity leave ends. A lot of them choose to stay out of the labor force. And so that means that there's always going to be a piece that's outside the policy sphere that is, the preferences of the people in the United States. And some moms want to go back to work and some don't, and some have the ability and some don't. And we're never going to close that gap. And I don't think we really should ever be aiming for like full employment of women. I don't think that's the goal of these policies. So I think keeping your eye on what's reasonable in this context is important, bearing in mind that everybody also has different preferences.
Mm-hmm. It's never just an economic or a cultural decision, for example.
For sure. But I'd add to it, there's something that's different in the United States than in a lot of other countries like Canada and Europe is the moms going to work part-time instead of full-time. We just have many fewer part-time options that are stable and than other countries do. And I sort of also see that in the report from the Yale Budget Lab that lower income that the increases in maternal employment aren't mostly felt along the part-time work. And, that has just been a puzzle about the American economy for quite some time. And it sure seems to me like, some sort of firm that wants to hire a bunch of stable part-time, you know, mothers should, be able to do so because there's just a gap in what's available.
Yeah, and we're getting close to the end here. Any final thoughts, like anything that you want to make sure that people take away from this? And I always like to ask, like, what are people getting completely wrong about this? About the debate over, like, yeah, go ahead.
So for me, it raised a lot of questions, from the high level policy levers down to the just the bricks and mortar, what's happening in the classroom, and so pieces that aren't appropriate that for Yale Budget Lab to take on, but the whole literature should be taking on. With more force, include issues of the workforce, special ed, and attendance. Those are the big three that I hear whenever I talk to people who are, in childcare classrooms. Also, big questions that we've got about measuring and monitoring quality, classroom quality. I think we're not doing a great job at that. And when we do a great job at it, it's really expensive to do. And so we're going to need to figure out some ways to do that. Of course, issues of program integrity have risen to the fore, recently as well. But sort of all of those pieces, I think, then feed into the parameters that go into Yale's budget model, and we really need to be doing more work on understanding how to reward, incentivize, think about trade-offs in a lot of those just real practical aspects of early childhood.
Yes. So don't just warehouse the kids. Like you want to put them in a quality environment. Sorry,
until we got those robots. That's right.
Yes.
Then
we get the robots.
Yeah. I would just like to applaud Budget Lab for putting the fiscal numbers out. I think that, we face probably hard fiscal choices. We haven't forced ourselves to face them up until now. We gave ourselves a $5 trillion tax cut last year. And I only say the order of magnitude of that because the scope of the fiscal impact that the Budget Lab has scored here over the 10-year window is like one or two of the line items that was in the tax bill last summer, which means that these are policy choices that we make on the Hill, whether we want to support program X or program Y. And I think sometimes when people hear universal childcare, they think it's outside the scope of the types of policies we've considered in the past. And that's not true. This is just a small chunk of what was an enormous tax bill last summer on a going forward basis, which I hope means that it becomes a real part of the policy conversation. We're in a tight fiscal space, and so I think every dollar is costly, but I think that this is much less expensive than I would have ballparked if somebody had asked me to do it, which makes me especially grateful that Budget Lab has put this out because it helps put an order of magnitude on the question.
Yeah, and to conclude and to finish up to that point, I mean, this is only the very early days for us. Like this is our first report that we put out here. As always, like, in the spirit of transparency, like all of the code is available online for researchers to use on their own. If you are at a think tank, you're on the Hill and you have policy ideas that you'd like to see analyzed in this framework, please let us know. Because, part of how we learn to improve the model and to figure out what features to build next depends on what demand for certain kinds of policies there are. So we'd always be happy to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, just I'm supposed to wrap up here, but to build on Elena's point, universal childcare was something that was seriously considered in the 1970s, and then and Build Back Better. So we got very close on that. So it's definitely not out of the realm of possibility. We discussed earlier how there might be a large overlap between the people in this panel and the people who love Star Wars. So may the fourth be with you. And thank you so much for joining us. And thank you again, John and the Yale Budget Lab for the analysis.